John Newton lay in his hammock in the lower deck of the Harwich. It had been 2 weeks since he had received the flogging on deck for running away. His back was red and sore, and his mind was full of despair. The ship had set sail from Plymouth, from England, and from Polly Catlett, the girl he loved. He was trapped on board, and the thought of not seeing her again for 5 years made John's heart sink. Even worse, no one on board ship wanted anything to do with him. Now that he was just a common sailor, the other sailors whispered and laughed about him, remembering his proud attitude when he was an officer. Day after day passed, and John's situation went from bad to worse. One moment he was filled with anger for everybody. He even imagined murdering the captain. At another moment, John even thought of ending his own life by throwing himself overboard. Still, something kept him from taking action either way. One morning after 3 weeks of sailing, John awoke to the sound of supplies being loaded in the hold below him. The Harwich had reached the Canary Islands, off the African coast, and was getting fresh food. Although he had heard the wake-up whistle earlier, John remained in his hammock. Sleep seemed like the only place where he could escape his surroundings.
"Come on, up on deck, Newton,"
said an officer as he climbed down the ladder to the lower deck. John muttered something under his breath.
"What's that, Newton? Don't be blaming me for where you are. Now get up."
The officer followed his remark with a swift kick to the bottom of the hammock. John snarled.
I'll get up when I'm ready to get up, and you can tell that to the cat.
His words were cut short by a sudden jolt. The officer had cut the rope on one end of Newton's hammock, causing him to tumble onto the floor.
"Now get up on deck as I said."
Newton scrambled up from the floor and thought about carrying out his plans of murder on the officer rather than on the captain, but all he could say was,
All right, I'm up."
When John finally emerged onto the deck, he noticed some unusual activity. Another sailor was loading his belongings onto a longboat.
"Where's he going?"
John asked a sailor nearby.
"He's being traded for a sailor from a merchant ship. I hear they're looking to trade one more."
A thought quickly went through John's head. Any place would be better than here. John hurried over to a nearby lieutenant.
"Beg your pardon, sir,"
he began, acting as respectful as possible.
"I'd like to volunteer to be the other man traded off this ship."
The officer sneered back.
"I hardly think anyone would want you, Newton. We'd probably have to pay them to take you. Still, it would be nice to get rid of you. Wait here."
John watched as the lieutenant talked with Captain Carteret and the captain of the merchant ship. Finally, he returned to John.
"All right, Newton, pack your bag. You've just been dismissed from His Majesty's service."
Within a half hour, John had packed his bags and climbed on board the Pegasus, a merchant ship captained by a man named Penrose. The captain greeted John.
"I hear your last name is Newton. You wouldn't be any relation to Captain John Newton from Wapping, would you?"
"He's my father,"
John replied.
"Well then,"
the captain continued,
"I welcome you on board as a son of a dear friend. I'm honored to have you join us. My first mate, Mr. Blunt, will show you your quarters."
John followed Mr. Blunt, but as they descended below deck, the first mate paused for a moment.
"Mr. Newton, I want to make you aware that I do not share Captain Penrose's enthusiasm for having you aboard. Any man unfit for the Royal Navy is unfit for this ship, but I hope you prove me wrong."
John Newton did not prove Mr. Blunt wrong. In the weeks that followed, John became well known on board the Pegasus for his laziness. He also used every opportunity he could to curse and swear as a way to impress his fellow sailors. His actions certainly didn't impress Captain Penrose, but the captain put up with John's attitude even after John made up a song for the crew that made fun of the captain. All that changed later in the year, though, when Captain Penrose suddenly became sick and died. A new captain was named Mr. Blunt. John knew that as soon as he was able, Captain Blunt would trade John back to a Navy ship as a common sailor. John had to get off the ship quickly. There was a man traveling aboard the Pegasus by the name of Amos Clow. John had heard Clow tell stories about the factory he operated on the African coast. This factory was not a place where things were made, but instead a terrible place where African slaves were kept in chains until they could be loaded on ships and sold on the other side of the ocean. Clow agreed to take John on as a business partner, and Captain Blunt gladly agreed to let John go. John was so glad to leave that he didn't even ask for his pay.
I'll have plenty of money of my own soon enough.
He thought. It didn't take long for John's dreams to disappear. Before he could even start working with Clow to get slaves, John got very sick. Instead, he had to stay at Clow's home while Clow traveled upriver.
My woman Pie will take care of you,
Clow said as he left. John soon found out that Pie had no interest in taking care of him. Instead, she treated him like one of her slaves, giving him only a little water and a few leftovers from her meals. His condition quickly got worse. One day he was so weak from fever that after begging for some food, he dropped his small plate of food in front of Pie.
Is that how you respond to my kindness?
She cried out in front of all of her servants.
Then you shall have no food at all.
That night, John was so hungry, he climbed out the window of his room into the moonlit yard. His stomach twisted in pain as he desperately searched for anything to eat. There, he spied some cassava plants growing nearby. The roots were often boiled up for food. John clawed them out of the ground with his fingers and tried to eat them raw. The uncooked roots soon caused John to throw up. No doubt, John would have died from illness and starvation were it not for the kindness of others. Pie's other slaves began to sneak food to John so he could get better. They also secretly carried letters John wrote in desperation to his father, asking for help. When Clow finally returned, John complained to him about his treatment, but Clow wouldn't listen, especially with Pie standing nearby. John was glad that when it was time for the next business trip, he was well enough to go with Clow. But after a trader falsely accused John of stealing, Clow began treating John like a slave too. John was chained on board the small riverboat. His only food and water came from the fish he caught and the daily rain showers. John continued to be treated as a slave by Clow and Pie to the point that he began to lose his mind. But just when he was losing hope of ever being free, they decided to trade John to another factory owner in the area. This man, instead of keeping John in slavery, fed and clothed him and paid him for his work. Soon John was not only healthy again, but he was even given ownership over a part of a factory. John quickly forgot his days as a slave or how it felt to be treated as one. Now that he had some money and power, he decided to live his life exactly as he wanted to, eating and drinking and using his position to treat his slaves harshly and to force them to do whatever he wanted. He even began to learn about the false gods of the natives and began to take part in their strange and ungodly rituals. It seemed that John could go no farther away from God. Little did he know there was a plan to rescue him. Back in England, John's father had not forgotten about his son. He had received the letters John had sent while as a slave of Clow and Pie. Despite all of John's past failures, his father still pitied him. He learned of a ship named the Greyhound that was heading to the African coast where John was located. Captain Swanwick had orders to try to find John and rescue him if possible. One warm February day, John was resting on the front porch of his home when he heard men approaching. It was one of his business partners, accompanied by 3 other men.
There he is. That's John Newton,
said his partner, pointing to John. John sat up expecting to make a deal to sell some slaves.
John Newton, I've been looking for you.
For me? What for?
John wondered if he owed the man some money.
Your father sent me to rescue you and bring you home to England on board my ship.
John paused for a moment. He remembered the letters he'd sent, but now as he looked around at his house and thought of the money he was making, he laughed.
Rescue? I think you can see that I'm not in need of any rescue. Tell my father that I don't need him.
With that, John stood up and rather rudely began to make his way inside.
Hold there a minute, Newton. Don't you realize how fortunate you are that I even found you? I was about to sail by this bit by land except that I saw your friend here signal for trading.
John laughed again.
Well then, I guess you're the lucky one. Go ahead and trade. I'm going inside.
Captain Swanwick wasn't about to give up.
Before you go, Newton, there's something you ought to know. Your father wanted me to tell you that you've come into a sizable inheritance. It seems an aunt of yours has passed away and left her fortune to you.
What was that?
asked John, turning from the door.
You've inherited a fortune. I've been instructed to bring you home. You'll be my personal guest on board the Greyhound.
Within an hour, John had packed up his belongings and left his African home. It was too good to be true. He was to be wealthy beyond his dreams, even wealthy enough to marry Polly Catlett. In reality, it was too good to be true. Captain Swanwick had made up the story, and it had worked. John was now a passenger on board the Greyhound. It didn't take long for Captain Swanwick to wonder why he had gone to all this trouble to rescue John. As a passenger, John had no responsibility on board. Instead, he passed the time with drinking and cursing. As John told the stories of his past adventures to the crew, Captain Swanwick's opinion of John worsened.
I'm no saint myself, Mr. Newton, but if there ever was a Jonah, it's you,
he said half-jokingly one day as they dined.
I'm afraid no good will come to us for taking such a rebel as you on board the Greyhound.
John thought little of Captain Swanwick or his words. After finishing their trading along the African coast, the Greyhound made its long journey toward England by making a big circle following the trade winds out in the Atlantic. To pass the boredom of the long trip out at sea, John turned away from drinking to reading. One night, he read a book that talked about living a life completely devoted to God and the peace and joy it brought. The more John read, the more he was reminded of his own life and his attempts to find satisfaction in all the world had to offer. In the stillness of the cabin, he mused.
What if these things are true?
He quickly pushed the thought from his mind, closed the book, and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, John suddenly awoke to the thunderous sound of waves and a cry from deck.
The ship is sinking!
The Greyhound had been trapped by a huge storm in the North Atlantic. As water began to pour into his cabin, John jumped to his feet and began to climb the ladder to the deck.
Newton!
The captain shouted.
Get my knife from the cabin!
John turned back on the ladder and let another crew member pass. Then in horror, he watched as that man emerged on the deck and in the next instant swept overboard to his death. Except for the captain's command, Newton would have been the one caught in the wave. John's narrow escape seemed only temporary, as the whole ship was battered by wave after wave. One section of the bow was destroyed and water flooded in. The crew and John pumped and bailed hour after hour as more water flooded in. As the captain looked at their hopeless situation, he turned to John.
Did I not say you were a Jonah? We'll no doubt all die unless we throw you overboard.
Still the crew continued to battle the storm into the morning hours. Although the winds had let up a little, there seemed little doubt the ship would sink.
Grab any wood you can to patch that hole,
cried the captain to the crew. Then turning to John, he said,
It's our only hope.
John could only answer,
If it won't do, then may the Lord have mercy on us.